Hello, Amy Gerhartz. Thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Hello, Shane. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'm excited to talk to you today. You have a fascinating story. You're a singer-songwriter turned into a personal development mindset coach. You have qualifications in neuro-linguistic programming, hypnotherapy, and you're the founder of a Higher Way of Living, which is a personal development firm, which I believe is something that's very cool. And so, I'm excited to talk to you all about mindset and, how we can work on that and what exactly beliefs do and what they mean for us. And it'll be a fun conversation. So thanks for coming on.
Absolutely. Anytime I can talk about self-improvement, it is a great day.
Yeah. So how about we start off with just a little bit about you? Like, how did you make that transition from, being a performer into this coaching space?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Performance always came naturally to me. I started performing and being in entertainment when I was really young, doing, theater and musicals and all of these things. Went to college for music, studied music. So it's interesting. I never had a fear of being on stage and being in front of people performing. What ended up happening is when I would be on stage, I would be in my head and I would second guess everything and I would start doubting myself and my abilities. And so it was never this oh my gosh, people are looking at me thing. It was more of a, oh my gosh, I'm not good enough. I suck. What if I screw up? Like, what if this happens? And then as I got older, I don't want to take away that and say that there weren't moments of euphoria. When you're in your element as a performer on stage, it can be absolutely magical. The problem with that is it doesn't happen all of the time. And so what do you do in the other 24 hours of the day? And how do you operate when you're not living in your element like that? And the one thing I found as I got older, probably started maybe in my teens. I was always kind of an awkward kid. My family was military. We traveled every 2 to 3 years, didn't really have a chance to have a hometown or childhood friends or things like that. And so we would just bounce from place to place. And I always just felt like just a little awkward. Like I was, I'm sure everybody listening to this could probably relate on some level.
Yeah.
And then as I aged, as I got older, I just started feeling really uncomfortable. And I think it was really probably around college, going to college, getting involved in the, this is what the normal college experience is of like, at that point, trying to look like Britney Spears or whoever else was out there, the pop icons with the lowrider jeans and like the crop tops and the stuff. And it didn't fit with me. And so because I didn't fit into that category or that perceived category of what I thought I should fit into based off of media and magazines and all of these things that, unfortunately give us the impression if we don't look like the people that we see that we're not good enough, I started just developing these behaviors of self-shaming, of really kind of beating myself up, of saying negative things to myself, of doubting my what I looked like, if I was attractive or not. And it was one of those things that I think it started with me pretty small. And it was this gradual thing that started just happening over time where I would just say something like, oh, I just feel so fat today, or, oh, I just feel this, and then I started, and now that I, with my education that I have now, I understand that what I was doing was creating this belief system that was probably just being reaffirmed from something at a much younger age of not fitting in and not having, certain things here and there. Who knows? That's for my therapist and I to work through. But that it started happening, and then I started pursuing music. And the interesting thing is that I also want to point this out to the audience and the listeners is that I was a go-getter. Like I was always the type of person, and maybe that was instilled from the military upbringing of like, you want something, just go figure out how to do it, and hey, we're just going to get up and move to another city. And so doing things wasn't scary to me. Taking risk wasn't scary to me at all. But the reason I point this out is that sometimes we associate, if you have self-doubt and shame and fear and all these things, that you just don't take action on things. I think it's really important to point that out, that if someone is a go-getter and they are an action taker, they can still have an equal amount of self-doubt, fear, shame, insecurities, all of those things layered in there too. And so I had moved to New York City post-college, was playing all around Manhattan. I was, working a day job, and I decided to quit my job to pursue music full time. And I ended up moving to Atlanta, playing music full time, bars, restaurants, hotels, weddings, you name it. I was doing it. I was playing like 7 to 8 times a week at one point. And the great thing was, there weren't a whole lot of women in Atlanta doing what I was doing. So I had this kind of little niche that I fit into with sort of that kind of softer pop lounge music type of thing that I was doing at the time, the acoustic singer-songwriter. But fast forward, I start touring, I start doing all these things with music. I start using my voice for commercial projects and all these things, getting nominated for some awards. And the interesting thing about this, the reason I give all of this layered stuff is that my career was still going, it was still growing, but I never stopped to look at what was going on internally in the process. So for me, even though I started doing all these great things with my career, a normal person would be like, oh my gosh, like that's so amazing. That's wonderful. Like you're selling albums and you're doing some bigger festivals and people are buying your music and they're listening to it and they're singing along with me. All the while I'm in my head thinking I'm not good enough. All the while I'm in my head and behind the scenes, I'm going back to my room and I'm saying how fat I look in my outfit or how ugly I am or my, I knew that it was getting really bad when I would go to Sephora, which is still one of my favorite stores, by the way. But I would go to Sephora and I would buy thousands of dollars worth of makeup in a year. Like it was out of control. Nobody needs thousands of dollars of makeup in a year. It's like, who in the world? But I kept doing all these things and I would go shopping and buying clothes and makeup and all these things to try to mask the fact that I just didn't feel comfortable in my own skin. And that's how this transition really started for me. I had just finished my first cross-country tour. I had gotten out of an unhealthy relationship with someone I dated in Atlanta. I moved to Nashville, Tennessee. I went on tour for 6 months first. I traveled all across the United States. Then I moved to Nashville. And I remember very vividly being in my apartment in Nashville and just like looking in the mirror one night and saying, I do not like the person I'm looking at. And I cannot live this way anymore. Like it was just this, I'm missing it. Like I was missing my entire life because I was so consumed with all of these negative thoughts and all of these behaviors that I had started to lean into and these belief system that I had built about myself or that had been programmed in, that I was missing it. I was missing all the accomplishments. I was missing all the great things that I was doing. I was missing the connections and the tours and the stuff that I had already done. I wasn't even allowing myself to celebrate it, almost as if it wasn't real, right? Like, it's like, here I am getting nominated for an award. I'm like, oh no, I don't know. Like, I still don't look, great. And I just had this really negative image about myself. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. It's freaking exhausting. Yeah. It's absolutely exhausting to be in your head about yourself that much and to doubt yourself that much. And to doubt yourself even when you're accomplishing things, I think is even, it's like you have any outside person looking in would be like, well, you have no reason to doubt yourself. And you're like, you're right. You're absolutely right. I didn't have any reason to doubt myself, but I did. Yeah. I still did. And I think that's something that I found resonates with so many people. And so from that day when I had my meltdown and just was like, my breakdown, I should say, I was like, because breakdowns lead to breakthroughs, right? So I had that moment where I was like, I can't do this anymore. And I just started working on me. And I made an agreement with myself that day. I said, no matter what comes to my head, I'm not going to allow it to come out of my mouth. No matter what thoughts come to my head, from here on out, like I'm not going to allow it to come out of my mouth. And it's been that way ever since. And that was 7 years ago now, almost, I think. And so I started my journey. It took a little while. It's not a light switch, like working on yourself is not something that happens overnight. I'm still learning so many things about myself, but I started this journey and then that's when I started realizing like, maybe there's something to this. And when that happened was I was doing this big music festival and I started touring across country again. I was still continued to tour across country for the following like 4, 5, 6 years after that. And And I remember slowly starting to share snippets of my story. Like just little, I would just be like, this is a song I wrote, and when I was in this unhealthy relationship that made me believe this about myself, right? Like I would just share little snippets, or this is a song that I'm playing around with about, loving yourself, whatever, and then the more I would share, the more people would come up to me and be like, oh, wow, I love that song and I love that message. And, it's interesting you said that because I go through that too. And the more I shared, the more people came up to me saying the same things over and over and over again. And yeah, I would get some compliments about my shows, of course, but it was really like, hey, that I loved what you said there, turned into, hey, I'm really struggling with that too. And the more vulnerable I became for my listeners, for my audience, the more connection was made. Mm-hmm. The more, it was almost like the music, because I allowed myself to be open and vulnerable, the music opened up. And then the connection started happening on stage. And so for a while I thought, oh my gosh, like there's something to this storytelling thing. There's something to this, understanding that we're all very similar. Mm-hmm. And so I know this is a long answer to your question, but super long story short, from then, I had known for a couple of years, I toured for about 7 years across country, and I loved it. But I also am, getting to a phase of my life where I knew, I'd love to be a mom someday. I'd love to be married someday. I was like, do I want to be touring across country for half of the year doing that? And so I was kind of figuring out how I could, still write and create music and follow my passion for that, but also use my voice to support people in other ways. And then COVID hit. I had one cross-country tour trip planned for 2020. It was going to be my last final run. But now I feel like I have to make it up at some point, but for everybody. But I was going up into Canada and then down through the northern United States and coming back, and then COVID wiped out everything. And I felt honestly like, as terrible as COVID was for so many people, and as confusing and frustrating as it still is for so many people, for me, it was like God opened up the heavens and came down and was like, this is it. You've been saying you want something different. You've been saying you want to figure out how to do this. Like, here you go. And before COVID, I love that we have to preface everything now by like pre-COVID and post-COVID.
Yeah.
So it's going to go in the history books pre-COVID.
Yeah.
So pre-COVID, I had already started taking some business classes and going to some seminars and workshops and things to try to just figure out where I wanted to go. And then I just, the universe aligned, like things just started working out. I found some mentors and some coaches to help me with my branding, with marketing, which I'm still working through. I mean, it's a never ending journey to market myself. And how to build a business, because I only knew how to work in music. I had no idea like how to build an email list or followings or even having different product levels and things like that. And so I just started working with all that. And then I became certified at an NLP, as you mentioned, hypnosis, hypnotherapy. I'm finishing up my master NLP certification now. And I just, the rest is history. Like it just started building and growing. And it all came down to that one simple thing of, to finally answer your question 20 hours later, it came down to me sharing my story. Yeah. That's how this all happened, because I just didn't keep quiet about it anymore.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because, I mean, it's a fascinating story in its entirety, right? But what I sort of like to focus on is this idea of, when you had that moment of self-reflection in the mirror, right? And you had this idea where you were like, which I don't really fully understand, so perhaps you can explain it a bit more, is that you didn't want to say what you were thinking. So what were you saying before then that you didn't like? Was it that you weren't being authentic, not sort of telling the truth about your truth or who you are? What exactly was that line? Because I say that because the sort of ended bit of your story is that, oh, well, now I'm telling everyone everything almost. Right.
Yeah. And thank you for that question. And I can definitely provide clarification. When I mean I was no longer going to let any of the negative thoughts that came to my head come out of my mouth. So all the shaming, you're stupid, you're ugly, you're fat, you're anything that I thought, that was not supporting my authentic self, that I know now is my authentic self. anything that was a lie that I had been programmed to believe, any doubt, any fear, anything even as simple as like, oh my God, I can't do this. Right? Like even that, I said, you know what, I'm no longer going to say the words, even if the thoughts still come to my head. I'm no longer going to say them, because when I say them, I give them power. And now I know as an NLP practitioner and hypnotherapist that when you say the words, your subconscious hears the words, right? It's like the three modalities in NLP, or the three major modalities we communicate in, is auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. And so anytime we can see something, say something, feel something, it connects in and programs into our subconscious. So that was, and I didn't know this at the time. I just kind of stumbled into like, okay, I'm just going to start small, right? It was like, I'm going to start with one thing. What's the one thing I can do right now to make a difference? Because at that point, I had no idea what to do. Like I had no clue. I mean, it wasn't like, they don't really, like, you don't go to school and they're like, by the way, if you ever struggle with negative self-doubt or like negative thoughts and shaming, this is your manual. Like they don't have that. And so I just thought, okay, I have no idea how I'm going to do this, but I know that I can't keep doing the same thing I was doing. So I get to shift something. What is that? And I thought, okay, anytime I think that I'm ugly, I'm not going to say it out loud. Anytime I think I'm stupid, I'm not going to say it out loud. Anytime I think I'm a failure, I'm not going to say it out loud. That was just the one disconnect. Like I wanted to be able to cut the thought off from being vocalized to give it power, and then go back in and work on the thought process as well and how to shift that. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I found it interesting because, let's say from my experience, all of my sort of insecurities and self-doubts and shamings and things like that only happens in my head. Like I don't speak it out loud, right? So I was just wondering where that sort of connection to speaking it, but I'm now, I guess, can assume that, well, you would say it to other people, or, maybe to yourself, or just in conversation where you're like, I sucked. People are like, how are your show?
Yeah. Well, and also too, and that actually, you bring up an interesting point I want to come back to. I also want to preface for the listeners, I talk to myself all of the time.
Gotcha.
Like all of the time. I am not a quiet human. You can ask my family, even as a little kid, like I would just sing to myself or talk to myself. So sometimes I was doing it and saying things, but I wasn't even consciously aware that I was doing it. Right? Like like I had a moment, this is actually a really funny story, Shane, that I was in a mall in Atlanta a couple years back. And this was before, this has nothing to do with self-doubt and shame. It's just a funny story that I was in the line, and I don't know if they have this where you are, but the malls here, like they have these like Starbucks are set up like right dead center in the mall. Like they know exactly where to position themselves. Like people are going to be shopping. They're going to want to buy coffee. So they had a Starbucks set up in the middle of this mall, and I was in line, like in the middle of a line, like this is pre-COVID, like a ton of people really close to me, and I am talking to myself, and I don't even realize I'm doing it. And then literally I stop myself, and I'm like, oh shit, I just said that out loud. And I look around, and I see the people that have clearly heard me talking to myself.
Wide-eyed.
And I was like, why? They're just kind of like, all right, this is the crazy lady in line. And I said, this is it. This is the beginning of the end for me. Like the downturn to me, like living on the streets, like having, needing medication, like all. And I say that in jest, of course.
Yeah. But, being one of those people that shout from the street corners,
Yeah. But I want to go back to what you said too, really quickly, if it's okay, about did I say this to myself or did I say it to other people too? And I think we do say things to other people. At least I know in female groups, right? I don't know if men do this, is because I'm not a man. I couldn't relate. But women, like we get together and the conversations, and we have, and I want to say this for the female listeners too, because I think this is really important. The words we say have so much power.
Yeah.
So much power, even if we're saying it in jest. Even if like when we get dressed up for a girls' night, like, does this look okay? Do I look fat? Like, do I look this? Even those simple words, like they program into our subconscious, right? It is all relatable. Or even when we get together with other women and we commiserate, or if we, and I used to be this person, I am not anymore, thank goodness. But when you kind of like talk about other people, or you gossip, or you do this and that, like all of that energy, just so you know, even if it's about somebody else, gets programmed in about you too. And so it's all of this, it's being overly conscious and overly aware of your language, of your environment, of your surroundings. Now, when I get together with my girlfriends, and this is, keep in mind, this is many, many, many years later. Like we're talking like 10 plus years later. All of our conversations. Now, granted, we have moments where we struggle and we get to support each other through those struggles, but all of them are positive and uplifting conversations to support each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just something to really think about, because your subconscious mind doesn't know what you're joking about. It doesn't know if you're kidding about something. It's just, yeah, I could go on with it.
No,
I could go on for days with this because I get so passionate about it. But yeah, that's really just start with your words. That's it.
No, it's great. And I think it's a very important point, because we do underestimate the power of language, particularly, just sort of casual language in how we communicate with, people around us, where we don't think things have that much of an impact. And quite often, I've found that when I'm talking to friends or whatever, like they'll, and it's more of a serious conversation, and I'll, say something else like, oh, that was some pretty good insight on my behalf. Not to be, sort of narcissistic about it, but sometimes you just have those moments where you're like, oh, I don't even know how I thought about that, but it just came out. And then afterwards, or a few weeks later, that friend will be like, oh, do you remember this one thing that you said to me? And I'll be like, that wasn't the main part of the story. Why'd you remember that bit? And it just sort of like reinforced the idea to me that other people will pick up on not the same things that you will, and place importance on it. And I think it's probably fairly easy for anyone to think about how one saying or sentence or phrase kind of just stuck with you for a long period of time and just feels tremendously powerful. And yet when that person said it, it probably was just, they were just speaking. Maybe it was part of a speech or a presentation or a conversation, but it doesn't carry the same amount of power that we tend to ascribe to it as a listener, right? And so it makes sense that, if your conversations with your friends are negatively dominated, then you're going to end up focusing on a lot of negative stuff, because that's the content that you're hearing, right? It's the same thing, I think, about how like what we consume online in social media and stuff, it matters, right? And it affects the way we think and see the world, even if we don't have an obvious consciousness of it at the time. And you can see that with anything. The more you're exposed to something, the more you start to see it in the world, right? Whereas before you probably didn't. And so if your attention is entirely or significantly focused upon negative aspects or self-reproaching dialogue or things like that, like that's how it's going to come to be dominant, right?
Yeah.
And probably you'll be unaware of it for the most part, because we're unconscious. I mean, our unconscious dominates overwhelmingly our psyches, right? Which is really hard to contend with, but that's just sort of how it is.
Absolutely. I had an interview with a friend of mine just recently for an event that she does for her Facebook group. And she had said, we both were laughing because we're like, if we knew it was happening consciously, we would stop it dead in its tracks. Right. And that's the thing, is it's because it's that thing that usually happens gradually and it happens over time. Mm-hmm. It's not like if I have this amazing mindset and all of a sudden I have one day where it's like, oh, I say these terrible things, I'm going to catch myself and be like, Amy, what are you doing? Right? Where in the world did that come from? But if it's something that's gradual, that happens over time, over and over and over and over again, it becomes to the point, like what you just said, sometimes you just don't even notice it. And the interesting thing too is it's like, well, then what happens when you do notice it? And I think that's where I hit that breaking point, because I was like, oh crap. Like I had to take a step back from me and just say, wow, I feel freaking terrible. and I'm crying all the time, and I can't stand the way I look, and I don't feel comfortable in my own skin, and I have absolutely no reason to feel this way outside of whatever my subconscious programming is that has developed over so many years,
Mm-hmm.
and now knowing that now, once again, like, I mean, I have a great family. I mean, granted, my family's not perfect by any means, but I have, very loving parents, and they provided for me. I never lived on the streets. I was never, and I also want to say this too, for the listeners, I'm not saying this as a comparison, because every single person has their journey, and every single journey is valid. Every single one, whether you had big traumas in your life or no traumas or very tiny traumas or whatever, everyone's valid. Because Shane, you said something really important about that person that remembered that one line that you said. It's the same thing with our brains and our minds. We could be little kids, right? Having the best day ever and, playing on the playground, and we've got hundreds of friends and people that love us and care about us, and one person bullies us and makes fun of us. And then we remember that.
Mm-hmm.
Our subconscious mind is just an information bank. That's all it is. And it gathers information, and it has memories. The belief system are based off of your memories, whether your memories are real or imagined.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we can take this tiny little bully, right? And now as adults, we see it as this tiny little bully, but as a innocent little 7-year-old kid, that becomes this big grandiose thing that gets programmed into the mind. And so anything that you've experienced or gone through could contribute to whatever you're at now. And so it's just I think the biggest part about the mindset work and why it's so important is that until you're aware of it, you can't change anything. You can't take action on anything. So the first step is to become aware, and then to say, oh, wait a minute, is this real? Like, is this thought that's coming up happening right now because it's a real situation or a real event? Or am I being triggered by something from my past? Or is it, there's so many different layers to it.
Mm-hmm. And you hit on a very good point of like, this isn't a comparative exercise. It doesn't matter who you are. What we're talking about applies to everyone. And, some people figure it out on their own, and that's great, or they don't, and they sort of just live with, whatever degree of torturer they have in their head, and that's just how they exist. And other people come out and, want to share that wisdom, being like, hey, actually, you don't have to live that way, And it's also interesting, this sort of like, not to sort of derail the conversation about it, but we do have this negative cognitive bias, right? And it, evolutionarily speaking, it makes sense, because it's sort of more important to know about things that could be threatening to you or dangerous than it is to focus on positive things. And so when, things threaten us, even if it's psychologically, like let's say, verbal bullying or something like that, our minds tend to focus on that a lot more, because hypothetically that's more important to focus on as it's a threat than is the nice thing that someone said, right? And you can sort of just see this with like, if 100 people leave a comment on a video or something like that, you'll be like, oh, these are really nice. And then someone will say something mean, and that's the one that you're going to focus and remember for for this reason, but it's not rational to do it that way, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, there's actually science to back that up too. I can't remember the actual study that they did, but it absolutely has been looked into of why our brains gather the negative. Why is it so much easier for us to remember the negative versus the positive, right? Think about like when you break up with somebody, you remember all the things they did wrong, like every single bit of it, right? But we can't remember it. Like it takes practice and effort to remember all the right things that were right. And so it's it's fascinating. I'm going to go find that statistic. I'll send it to you, or that study that I read about that. And I wish my brain was a little bit more active, but I love what you said about the comparison thing too. And that's a big deal that I lean into and I coach into as well with my clients, because I remember even something as simple, when I was in my 30s, I had a lot of trouble focusing, and I would go to events and music festivals, and I would be in front of people and having conversations with people, and I wouldn't hear a thing that they said. Like my mind would start bouncing around. So I remember finally going and seeing somebody, and when she, we did some testing and things like that, and she's like, okay, well, I'm going to give you a diagnosis of ADHD, like adult, adult ADD, and for adults. And I'm not saying this correctly right now. Sorry. Thank you for being patient with me, listeners. And the interesting thing about that is when she said that. Now I grew up in a family that has people that experience mental illness.
Sure.
My mother has depression. I've got depression runs in my family, and I remember when and amongst other mental illnesses run in my family as well. And I remember when I got this woman's diagnosis, and I don't say that I've been diagnosed with, I just want to point this out, I don't say that I've been diagnosed with ADD. I experience ADD because I think a lot of times when we get a diagnosis for something, we give it so much power over our lives. But in that moment, I remember feeling stupid. I remember immediately, like my first trigger reaction was, well, I'm not going to tell people because I feel stupid. Like this is so minor in my mind in comparison to what my family members have been through and what they experience, and the people I know really closely, people that have struggled with suicidal thoughts, people that have struggled with not even being able to get out of bed every day. And here I am, I can't even focus. Like I was doing the comparison game so much and this was also before I did all of this work, by the way. Mm-hmm. So this was just this comparison. And it's so easy for us to do that. It's so easy for us to minimize our experiences and to put them up against someone else's. And I think it's just such an unhealthy route to go down into. And I know that now. I now know how unhealthy that is, to do that. But it's so easy for us to put ourselves in the back seat and to say, well, I haven't, I still have, a loving family. So my life isn't as bad, or I still have this and that isn't as bad. And I think it was Brene Brown maybe that said she read something once, and I'm also going to misquote this, but it was the person who has the person who has the experience is the most important. Or the person who went through the experience, their experience is the most important, if that makes sense. Something along those lines. Now, I hope Brene doesn't reach out to me and say, you just totally screwed up everything I just said. But the point behind the quote or the message that she was saying is that your experience is the most important one to you. Mm-hmm. Whatever you've been through, Shane, is absolutely valid and the most important thing. And whatever I've been through is absolutely valid and the most important thing to me. And it's learning how to, each one of our experiences can coexist together, right? Like mine doesn't have to be better than yours doesn't have to be better than mine, like, or more important. Like everyone is important. Every experience is important.
Right. And absolutely. And we do have this, by the way, shout out to Brene Brown if she's listening to this podcast.
Yay, Brene.
That would be hilarious. That would be hilarious.
I know, right? Shane and I want to come on your podcast, Brene. Yeah. Let's do that.
But this comparative culture phenomenon is very strange. I mean, it's understandable to a large degree, I guess, because we do tend to compare ourselves in many ways to other people, often for good reason, but sometimes it backfires, right? And so there's a sort of natural tendency to be like, oh, well, it could be worse, or I should be more grateful, or, we kind of have these expectations of ourselves, at least, to be better than we are, even in not comparing, right? And then the sort of trap that's easy to fall into too is when that happens, it makes you feel worse, because then you're like, I should be more grateful. I should, not be complaining about my situation. Other people have it worse. And that just makes you feel worse, probably, because then you feel guilty for having these thoughts, which is just an unfortunate thought cycle that is easy to get trapped in. But it actually doesn't matter. And the weird part about it is that, most nice people don't want that for you either. If you had gone to your parents or whoever your family members are who have had, these sort of serious depression issues, and you had said to them, I have some ADD, they wouldn't be like, I mean, they might, but hopefully they wouldn't be like, yeah, well, that's nothing. I've been through so much worse. And I mean, some people are like that, but they're just suffering, right? It's not fair to sort of...
Yeah, they're absolutely suffering.
Yeah. Because people who are happy don't criticize other people, and they let them have their experiences. And they're like, okay, well, this is something that you got to deal with. I'm sorry you have to deal with it because it's tough and it has all sorts of implications in your life in various ways. And, I wish you the best and let me know how I can help you. Something like that, where it's not a comparative. It doesn't make sense to compare our experiences with other people on a broader scale, in this context that we're talking about, because it's unhelpful, I think. I guess sometimes people, and you, sorry to interrupt, but I guess sometimes that does lead people to feel more gratitude for the things that are going well or that they do have. But how often does that happen versus do you end up feeling guilty for your own thoughts about the situation? I don't know what the answer to that question is, but it's just an interesting thought. Yeah.
It is an interesting thought. And I think I love what you said. It's interesting that last line I want to come back to, that, using comparison as a way to feel gratitude. I wonder if it's really comparison or if it's really more empathy and understanding versus the word comparison, right? Like, you see someone else's life, you feel empathetic towards them and what their experiences are and what they're going through, which then triggers gratitude towards your life. Because if you're looking at someone and be like, ugh, that person's life sucks, like, I'm great, like, then that's clearly an unhealthy way of of feeling gratitude for your life, and we could come back to that. But I love what you said about happy people don't compare themselves to others, and I agree with you on that. If you are someone who is filled with joy, and I have worked really hard to get to this place in my life, because I did used to compare myself to others all of the time. And I am so grateful, going back to gratitude, every day, because I wake up and when I see other people now, I see it as inspiration.
Yeah.
I see people that are doing the things that I want as, oh, wow, let me figure out how they did that. And let me give them a call. Let me see if I can get them on my podcast. Let me see if I can, talk with them or work with them or coach with them. And because I want to learn what they learned. And it's a completely different way of looking at things. And the great thing too is that because I have such a high regard for myself now, and I'm in this place of fully loving myself, really truly loving myself, all aspects of me, the stuff I like, the stuff I don't like as much, or wish that I didn't do all the time, every single part of me, I've developed this incredible solid relationship with, that I have no need to compare myself to other people. And and the other thing too is that I have adopted a very big live and let live type of mentality. Like, other people can say things, they can do things, they can try to hurt me or offend me or any of those things. And it only bothers me if I choose to let it.
Yeah.
It genuinely, it's like I live with a force field around me every single day of just self-awareness, of knowing who I am. And I'm not saying there aren't days that I don't falter a bit, but that's where the coaching comes in, and the training and the skills, having all my tools in my toolbox to be able to combat those days. But I genuinely, I look at everyone else as my ally now. I look at everyone else as someone I can learn from, someone I can grow from, someone I can connect with. And it's such a beautiful place to live in. Shane, I'm sure that you've experienced this on your own as well. It's just a lovely place to be in when you just feel good about you. And just, and
the
realize
world.
like, hey, and the world. Exactly.
And there's no enemies, right? You don't look to make enemies where there aren't any, or where there might be, but, why spend your efforts and energy there? It's free rent in their head, as they say. I mean, they have free rent in your head, as the expression goes. Like, don't let them. But so, on this sort of topic of like how you got to this place of, sort of fully accepting and loving yourself, right? A lot of it has to do with this topic of mindset and reshaping, I don't want to say bad, but not helpful mindsets, right? That might sort of stem back to when you were, 1 or 2 or something like that. And that's true for everyone. But so how can one, let's say we're assuming that people are now aware of a particular bad pattern of thinking or behaviors, or both. They're not all feeling that. I mean, they're all connected. What's the way to sort of start combating that? I mean, sure, it's going to be different for specific individuals, but is there a sort of general framework that you operate under?
There is. I actually just launched with my company a online course because I knew that there were so many of my clients that I was working with one-on-one, and we were diving into some deeper hypnotherapy. But after a while, I realized, okay, well, I'm going through some foundational things with everyone. So why don't I put this into a course where people can start working on shifting their mindset and opening up their awareness even more of every single little thing. And I'll give a couple tips that are from that course here. It's called Rise Up and Thrive. You can, come find it over on A Higher Way of Living, or you can always hop on a call with me if anybody is listening to this and is kind of like, hey, I need some guidance. And I'll be completely transparent with all of the listeners. If I'm not your coach, I'm not going to work with you. Like I will guide you in the right direction. It's okay.
Yeah.
I think so many people, the first step, hands down, before you do anything is look for support. Don't try to do this all on your own, right? Now, that could be a friend, it could be a family member, it could be a coach, it could be a therapist, it could be books, it could be videos, audios, whatever you need to dive into. But definitely don't do the thing where you sit back, it's like, okay, I'm aware, I'm just going to figure it out as I go. Like there's a reason that we all have our gifts. There's a reason we all share our stories. There are hundreds of thousands of amazing coaches out in the world. So if I'm not the right coach for you, then by all means, I'll help you find someone who is. But with that being said, some of the basic things that I start everyone with goes back to what you and I talked about before. We already know self-doubt and shame exists, right? We already know that it's happening. What we want to do first is cut that off. So I always, with my clients, create a safe place of saying, whenever you're in a session with me, and from here on out, if you and I are going to work together, no more self-doubt and shame, like no more shaming is allowed to come into this space. We're going to work on the thoughts. We're going to work on reprogramming, but we're not going to beat ourselves up anymore. So whatever happened, wherever you went, like whether it was good stuff, not so good stuff, anything that you've done in your life, it happened. And the more we dwell on it, the more we shame ourselves for it and beat ourselves up for it. It doesn't support us on our journey. So I try to tell my clients, like from day one, no matter what happens from here on out, we're not going to beat ourselves up over it. We're not. Say you're on a diet and you fall off the wagon and you have a donut. Okay, you had a donut. So what? We're not going to beat ourselves up for it, right? We're going to create a space for you to be forgiving to yourself and to be open to yourself, to say, all right, I know that I'm not going to be perfect with this because there's no such thing as perfection. And this is day one of the rest of my life. So if I'm going to do that, how do I do that in a safe place? So it's creating a safe space for you to allow yourself to make some mistakes, allow yourself to be kinder to yourself in that process. And then the second step, we really dive into, as I mentioned before, the visual, auditory, kinesthetic. I like working a lot with NLP. I do a lot of perspective shifting with my clients. I do a lot of reprogramming of their decision-making strategies and things like that. And then, of course, diving even deeper into hypnosis to reprogram, and hypnotherapy sessions that it can be, these 2 to 3 hour sessions of trauma healing and things like that. But with my clients, once we create this safe space, the next is to look at those three, the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. What are the words you're using? What are the things you're seeing, right? And what's the environment that you're in that's maybe triggering or causing emotions and things like that. The emotional connection, the visual stimulus, the auditory stimulus, and the kinesthetic as well. So learning how to kind of identify those things. And it's everything as simple as the words we use. We'll go back to that again since we talked about that so much today already. But that can be something as simple as like, oh, I need to do this. Or what you were saying earlier, like, I should have done that. I should have done that. Well, you can should on yourself all the time, but you probably shouldn't.
Yeah.
That thing of like, stop shoulding on yourself. Like, just say, I instead of saying I need to do this or I have to do this for my job, which makes it task driven, which makes it almost this obligation. I need to go to the gym. I need to do X, Y, and Z or whatever it is. You get to do it. It's like those little tiny shifts. I get to do this. I get to show up today. I get to be on this awesome podcast with you, Shane. Like everything gets to be an opportunity. Everything. And those tiny, tiny little shifts in our language, right? The little things that we say are so important. The same thing with our surroundings. Like, where are we hanging out at? Where are we going? Who are the people we see every day? What are the conversations we have with those people? How do we interact? Are these things that are going to be uplifting and positive, or are they things that are going to start tearing us down? And it can even be something as simple, coming from the music background, the music we listen to.
Mm-hmm.
If you're listening to negative music all the time that has these lyrics that are very heavy and draining, that's what you're going to start to feel. So it's learning how to identify all of the stuff that's going on internally as a reflection of everything that's going on externally as well too. And how do we get them into alignment with each other?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's
just some basics.
Yeah,
it goes a lot deeper than
of course.
And in the course, and in the course that I have, I put together about 14, 15 modules, and I have a bunch of bonus modules in there and hypnosis audios for people to listen to, because I really want people to be able to start having the opportunity to reprogram on their own. And not everybody can afford a coach too. Like, let's be honest, like coaching can be expensive, and but if you have that opportunity, by all means, find a coach to work with. That's one of the best ways.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very interesting and clearly successful framework to operate under. And sort of the one part that I'd like to highlight, or there's two actually. Well, the one is this idea of where I start. Okay, so in psychotherapy training, right, you learn that the most important part of therapy is the relationship you form with your client, right? That's the mechanism of all change. And the modality and techniques that you use only account for, like, somewhere, depends on the study, between 10 and 15 or 20% of actual therapeutic change, right? What's the most important thing is the relationship that you have. And there's lots of reasons for it, right? It's whether it's because you need to learn how to trust people, how to, engage safely, how to communicate effectively. Is all kinds of things, right, that go into that. And there's a good literature on that. But I say that because your framework replicates that within the self, right? Mm-hmm. That's sort of what I got from it, where the first step is, and as you said, when you're creating this sort of safe space, but the first thing before you try and change or undo anything is sort of learning that, like, okay, well, I have a relationship with myself, which philosophically is complicated, but, experientially makes sense intuitively to most people. And so the way that we deal with ourselves is important, and maybe the most important, right? So whether it's how you talk to yourself, do you encourage yourself? Do you treat yourself well? Do you support yourself? And, people use all kinds of metaphors or analogies to say, you should treat yourself like a best friend, or you should treat yourself like someone who you're responsible for caring for, is a different way of looking at it. And so, when you do these things, like you think you messed something up, right? Or you didn't have such a good day, or something went wrong in your estimation. Do you say to yourself, I suck, I'm the worst, whatever? Or do you say to yourself, actually, it's okay. Like, yes, that was a mistake perhaps, and there were some negative consequences that I now have to deal with, because that's true too. But it's okay, because you learn. And, most people make decisions based on the sort of simple premise of, I thought it was a good idea at the time, right? That's the sort of general way that people approach it, is you do it in the moment. You're like, this seems like the best option, even if it's just to reduce, some negative affect. You're doing it because in that moment, that's just what you need. And then if you were a friend or someone who you were responsible for caring for, how would you approach that? If a friend comes to you and says, I cheated on my diet today, or I messed this thing up, or didn't go as I thought, would you say, oh, you suck, you'll never get it together? Yeah. Like, no, you wouldn't, presumably. You'd say, it's okay, it happens, there's stumbling blocks, it's all about learning. What can we learn from it? Just approach it in a very nice, supportive way. And if you can learn to sort of do that for yourself, then that's how you sort of start to make those efficacious changes, because then it doesn't matter what the situation is, it's how you deal with yourself that sort of comes to the front anyway, right? So it's not necessarily about specific instances, although those are perhaps very important to address, but the sort of underlying mechanism is your relationship with yourself and how you see and feel about yourself. Which kind of leads into the second point, which is that, this kind of change that we're talking about, and you had mentioned this before, it's not something you can do immediately. You can start immediately, but it's a process that takes a lifetime, you might say. If you think about it just in terms of the strength of various neural pathways, the more you think about something, the stronger the neural pathways are, the more embedded it becomes in your consciousness and even subconsciousness. And so you're sort of now creating new neural pathways to compete with that, because you can't just get rid of them. And so it takes a lot of practice to strengthen those up sufficiently to a point where there's actually some competition now. It's a weird analogy, I know, but it's somewhat neuroatomically accurate. But it's like, like I use the analogy of like going to the gym, right? If you're not an exercising person, the first year kind of sucks, right? You're kind of forcing yourself to do it a lot. And, it takes a lot of like effortful willpower to do it. But then at some point, and it's not exactly clear when or why, at least it wasn't to me, you kind of are like, oh, this is just part of my normal way of being now, right? And you might even start to look forward to it, and it just becomes automatic. So it's not like a daily struggle of like, should I go to the gym? Should I not? COVID. Should I exercise in my basement? Should I not? It's not that kind of a thing. It's just like, okay, well, this is what I'm doing now, right? And so that's the other side starts to sort of weaken and wither away. And while it's still there, it doesn't have as much of an impact, right? So I just wanted to sort of bring the practice element up. And, what do you sort of make of that?
No, I agree 100% with everything you just said. And I would love to go back to your first point really quickly too. And
go for it.
Something that I've found that's been really, really helpful for not only myself, but my clients is, I love what you said about the way you talk to yourself, right? And the if you were talking to your friend, you wouldn't say, oh, you suck, you're not going to get that, you're not going to make that diet, you're never going to win. You would say, that's okay. I love to encourage my clients to take things even one step further. Let's figure out, okay, it happened, so let's figure out why. Let's figure out where it's coming from. I really love creating, when I do that space of creating that safe space of this, there's no more shaming allowed from here on out, right? Like no more beating yourself up from here on out. I also love to encourage my clients to look at everything as neutrality. Like, what if you weren't you? What if you were just starting to observe you and the way your behaviors were, and you just started kind of looking and nothing was good, nothing was bad, because we assign meaning to everything around us, right? Like every event could be a neutral event and we decide whether it's a good or bad event. And so if we have that, and then I also kind of coach into emotions, like how to listen to your emotions, to understand your emotions. How can you be neutral with your emotions? Like just because I'm angry, that doesn't mean that's a bad thing. Just because I'm sad, that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It means that my body's trying to tell me something, right? Yeah. There's something I care about. That's like we get information from ourselves if we really start to take time to look at it. So in those moments, if you do fall off the wagon, because guess what, you're going to, no matter what happens, you're right. It is a lifelong journey. There are still things. Oh my gosh, hold on. My ADD just kicked in. Let me go back. So if you do fall off the wagon, and when you fall off the wagon, being able to say, okay, so I did that. I'm not proud of it. It's not what I want long term, but let me, instead of shaming myself, instead of going back into and feeding my old pattern and feeding my old belief system, let me just sit with myself for a second and really identify why it happened. What was it that got in the way? What became more important? What did I tell myself in the process? What did I lean into? Because until we know why we're doing something, until we can really get to that core level, we can't make a different decision. So it's just decision-making strategies, figuring out like, did I see something? Like we'll go back to the diet example. Did I drive by Dunkin' Donuts and then I remembered how good they tasted and I said, screw it, I'm just going to pull in. Like, what was it?
Yeah.
Where did it come from? What caused you to create that action in the first place? So anyway, to go to your second point about I agree with you 1,000%. It's just like anything. You have to work at it for it to work. You absolutely do. And I still 7 years later have moments, and I continue my education. I'm in a master leadership program right now, personal leadership program. That's a year program where we have these intense sessions and we work through stuff. And there are still days where I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, I have that moment where like, I thought I was over this. Like, are you kidding me? Like, this is popping up. And the more you learn about yourself, it almost becomes, I almost find it comical now, because I'm like, oh, wow. Like, when I make all the connections of like, okay, so I did this because of that, which led to this, which caused me to do that, which caused that belief system. Like, it almost becomes, it almost becomes a game sometimes. It's like, all right, I wonder what I'm going to figure out about myself today. Like, figure out about myself. And I agree with you too. The good part about it, though, I don't want to discourage the listeners. Probably the absolute best part is what you hit on, Shane, is that after a while, it does become autopilot and it becomes so much easier to manage. And while you're in the process of being aware of yourself, you're going to notice when things come up so much faster. I was talking with a woman earlier today, and we were talking about confidence, and she was equating confidence as like a roller coaster, right? Like, you have days where you're really confident and then not so confident, days where you're really confident and not so confident. And you kind of go with this up and down type of feeling. And I said, yeah, but the great thing about doing mindset work, and the great thing about, being in this state of constantly observing yourself, is that eventually that roller coaster starts to level out, right? Like, things start to level out. They're not these big highs and lows the way it used to be. Everything kind of just levels out. It's like that kind of slow plane of the roller coaster. And then whenever you feel yourself going into a dip, you have all the tools to be able to say, whoa, 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 hold on. I'm going to pull myself back up.
Yeah.
Hold on, wait a minute. Like, I feel like I'm a little off this morning. Let me just take a minute to sit with myself, see if I can figure out where it's coming from, and pull myself back out of it. But that takes so much time. It's like master level Jedi mindset training to be able to get to that point, but it is absolutely worth it if everyone listening is willing to put that effort and time into it.
Yeah, I mean, what else are you going to do, right?
You got a life to live. How do you want to live it,
yeah.
right?
And those years are going to pass anyway, so you might as well be working towards something better, which I think inherently most people want. We have this human desire to do and be better sort of all the time. It's very curious, but that does seem to be around most of the time. And it's interesting what you say, because, even though you've been doing it for 7 years, I mean, I could probably fairly accurately predict that in 50 years, stuff is still going to happen and you're going to be like, what did that? Why did I do that? Why? Like, because as we said, so much of our psychic life is unconscious that drives our behaviors. And so you confront a situation that's relatively new, or that's, reminiscent of something in childhood that you don't have actual memories for. And all of a sudden you're doing something that you're like, what's going on? Why am I doing this now? But I guess that the goal is kind of to reach that point where when that happens to you, you don't see it as a personal failure or a setback or anything like that. You're like, oh, this is just another angle that I got to work around, or I need to adjust a little bit. And if you can make it into a game of sorts, I mean, what's better than that, right? Then it's fun to do it too. And games are hard, right? Easy games are boring. We don't like those kinds of things. We like challenges. So it's not such a bad thing to sort of view it that way. I think it's a really good point.
I absolutely agree. Absolutely. And that is the biggest thing. You hit the nail on the head. It's not that, and some practitioners will say, oh, you can completely uproot and remove a belief system for good. And I do think there are some of them that you can, but some of them might be with you the rest of your life, right? I think there will always be a little girl inside of me, a little version of Amy that feels insecure. Right?
Yeah.
But now I know how to comfort that little part of me. I know how to have a conversation with that. I know how to
nurture it.
Bounce back and nurture it. Yeah. And also say that, guess what? That part of me is valid. It's allowed to be there.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Like, it doesn't have to take over my life. It doesn't have to run my life. And whenever she starts screaming and throwing a temper tantrum, I can, have a moment with her, and that's okay. But it's what you said, learning how to navigate your life without the shame and guilt and verbal punishment attached to it.
Yeah. Which is not easy to do, because especially if it's been your default mode for so long, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But again, it's like, well, yeah. But it's also sort of touches on the point of how change happens when suffering reaches a sort of maximal point, right? When you reach a point where you're like, I'm sick of this shit. For lack of a better way of saying it.
Lack of a better word. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with you. And you hear that from everybody. I mean, I don't know anybody that doesn't have a story of transformation that didn't get to that point.
Yeah.
Like if you're out there, if you were like, oh yeah, I just transformed and I felt fine like before,
yeah,
I'd love to hear your story, because I just don't think it exists. I think you're right. You get to a place where you've just had enough, and I would love to be able to get to more people before they get to that place personally, like the rock bottom place.
Yeah.
But I'd love to get them on the decline, like slowly, so that we can revert back. But sometimes you have to get to the rock bottom.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to hit the decline, and you have to go through that, because otherwise you wouldn't realize the value of doing this type of work.
Yeah. And it applies in all sorts of things, right? If you hate your job, right, and you're suffering at it, you can put up with it for, well, it depends, but presumably a fairly long amount of time, with a great deal of suffering that comes with it. But you do reach a point where you're like, I'm done now, right? And it's quite decisive, and often leads to very sudden changes in people. Like you had this sort of, right? COVID helped you out a little bit, but that's okay.
COVID just jump started it a little faster. I was already on the train for a couple of years. Like, I felt myself riding that train of shifting.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's interesting that you bring up the job. I have a couple clients that really struggle with stuff at work, and being able to stay in control around certain people and coworkers and bosses and whatnot. And that, I think, is another layer, because sometimes we think it's the job. And it very well could be the job, but it also very well could be us. And learning that, if you have a belief system about you, the belief system is going to be the same no matter where you go and what you do.
Mm-hmm. And your relationships with other people tend to mimic those of childhood, unless you do something consciously about it, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which often ends people in, unfortunately, disastrous places, but that's how life works. But yeah, and also, there is also an element of what we might call divine intervention, or chance, if you don't like that word, but of just sort of, when people hate their jobs and then they're fired, and then they realize what a liberation it is, right? Like I had a woman come on the podcast a few months ago who wrote a book called Why Losing Your Job Could Be the Best Thing That Ever Happened to You, right? And it was really about this phenomenon of like, actually, it doesn't have to be a bad thing, right? It's, again, it comes to this perspective taking of like, how do you see this in your life, and what meaning do you make from it? Because it is entirely, up to you is the way to say it, but it's not exactly right, because a lot of it's automatic, right? So it's hard to ascribe that responsibility, but I think you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all have a choice. Every single one of us has a choice. Every single one of us, I like to use the word control, but I know it rubs a lot of people the wrong way. I think every single one of us is in control of ourselves and the choices we make. Nobody's holding a gun to our head. And the rare circumstances that someone is, hopefully that never happens to anybody. But for the most part, we all are in control of ourselves and our choices. And what I mean by that is we cannot control other people or the things that happen around us, or even say something physically that happens, but there's a little gray area with that. But I genuinely believe we are in control of our emotions, our attitudes, our actions, our reactions, the way we see something. Being able to perspective shift is, I think, one of the most powerful tools that anybody can have. Even if your listeners wanted to start there, how do I see this situation I'm in differently?
Yeah.
Like, that's huge.
Entertain other possible interpretations, but rarely entertain them, not just to, play the game. It's like, how might someone else see this situation? And then saying, maybe I could look at it that way. And it just sort of starts like that, right? It's just that little seed that doubts your current belief about the situation, and the other seed that starts a new way of looking at it. And that's all you need, right? And then it grows. Well, it's not all you need. You need to water your seeds, but that's how it starts. But anyway, listen, we've done our hour and it's flown by.
I saw that. Yeah. It's just been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much again for having me.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Please tell people, I'll link to stuff in the description as well, but where can people find you and promote stuff? Yeah.
Well, you can find me anywhere, really. It's Amy Gerhartz. My company is A Higher Way of Living. You can go to ahigherwayofliving.com. You can book a free discovery call with me. I have free gifts all the time. I do so many free events like master classes and summits and virtual events and all of these things, just to provide education to people. By all means, follow me on all the socials and the things like that as well. I say the socials like I'm feeling my age coming on. I'm going to be 40 in like a couple weeks. So I'm like, oh yeah, all the socials. Follow me on the Facebook.
On the Facebook,
on the Facebook. And by all means, if anybody once again is struggling with anything, feel free to reach out and I'll do my best to support you in any way that I can, or help you find support from someone else. So and I also, I already said I had free gifts. Yeah, perfect. Just go to the website. It's great.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you again. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to have another conversation with you soon. Be fun.
I look forward to it, Shane. Thank you so much.
All right.